Okay, good afternoon. Um, we're on the roof of my house today. For those doing both classes, you've probably seen the other video. We're outside, so there's a bird singing now, but it sounds nice. What I'm going to do today is look at the external analysis, and I'm going to just cover 4 areas. And again, this is like an overview of things. If you've got questions, ask me questions about things in particular. The book goes into quite a bit of detail. I've tried finding some decent links to things on YouTube that explain it, maybe more professionally than I can in this given situation. Again, I don't want to be using PPT with me just doing a voiceover. If you go on YouTube, just do a search for any of these things. There's plenty of stuff on there and it looks pretty boring to me. So that's why I'd rather show this. This is like the view I get looking that way. We're about 10 minutes from the university. It's over there somewhere. Okay, so I'm going to look at 4 things here. We're going to look at the Porter 5 Forces model. We're going to briefly mention strategic groups, the industrial life cycle, and mention about the macro environment. So some I'll go into more detail and others maybe give 1 or 2 examples about it. So the external analysis looks at the environment around and in the industry that we're dealing with. Now, some vocabulary first of all. So when we talk about an industry, we're talking about the different organizations that are doing a similar kind of thing, maybe in a similar market. So we might talk about the automotive, the car industry, or we might talk about the Korean car industry. So we've narrowed it down a little. Organizations, I try and use the word organization because not everything is a company. Organizations might possibly be like a non-profit organization or something. So not every group is there to make money. Companies tend to be businesses that are in the realm of making money, but strategy also works with other organizations as well. Companies, I might use that sometimes, and I'm referring to specifically to businesses that are there for making profit, for making money. The external analysis looks at the opportunities and threats within that existing industry or the industry that people want to go into, or the environment around it, and how that is going to affect your actual business, the way you work. Using my ultra low tech guidance here. Again, I'm keeping this simple. It's a bit like writing on a blackboard in class, which I would be doing. So it's not quite that different to being in class, except we're outside and you're at home wherever you are. We use symbols like this. We use models to really view and understand situations. So quite often in management, you get these different sort of symbols and models and that sort of, and you're trying to remember. But it helps you visualize what the situation is. Okay? So by doing this and by looking at this, it helps us understand it a bit clearer. Okay? So this was dreamt up, or this was designed some time ago, but the situation was still existed before somebody put it into this kind of framework. Now, basically, you've got these 5 different areas that we look at. And the thing with these is that if all of these are weak, if there's not really much pressure from any of these areas, that's the best position for a company to be in. Because it means it's free to do what it wants to do, to be able to make a profit, to be able to do well in its business. If there's an increased pressure in any of these areas, for example, if the existing or the competition increases in the existing industry, then that will put pressure on. Now, if there isn't any, if all of these are weak, like if it's very difficult to get into the market, if there's very little competition in the market, if your buyers have very little ways of putting pressure on you, if your suppliers are quite weak in terms of pressurizing you, and if there's no substitutes, chances are somebody's going to come in. However difficult it is to come in, somebody's going to get in there. So that's, in theory, it's a great position to be in. In reality, it doesn't happen very often because somebody will come in. So we've got to expect that there are going to be strong areas here that we have to deal with. It's part of the business world. Otherwise, if there isn't much pressure, there will be very soon. Okay, let's look at one situation. So if we talk about the car industry or the car market, the car sales market, now if we look at in Korea, now this is where it gets complicated. It's easy to look at something and in one isolated situation, but if we look at the Korean car market, 20 years ago or more, Korea was fairly well protected. It was difficult to enter, for other people to enter. One, because the established car makers, I think there were 4 at the time, Kia, Hyundai, Daewoo, SsangYong. Samsung hadn't really started at that point. They were just about to start. So it had 4 major players, and actually SsangYong were kind of doing more trucks than cars, from what I remember. So they were controlling it, and it was difficult to get in because they were big players. The other thing was, it was very difficult for outside companies to come in from other countries because of the trade barriers. The Korean government had very high trade barriers, so it was very difficult to import cars. There were very, very few imported cars. Also, another barrier was the cultural barrier, that people used to buy homegrown products. Buying Korean was best, and they were supporting the country, which I believe is a good policy. And because these companies were quite big, they were able to sort of fairly well control the suppliers, and there weren't really many substitutes to them. Now, substitutes get a bit dodgy here. A foreign car is maybe not a substitute, but if we're talking about substitutes for transportation, we're talking about buses and trains, etc. Well, there were substitutes there. But if anything, they would, I'd say they were on the decline, not because they weren't as good or they weren't keeping up, but people were going more towards car transportation. However, things changed. In 1997, there was a financial crash, and that forced some major changes. Markets had to open up. Some companies didn't do very well. Daewoo had a major problem. Daewoo got bought out by General Motors. So General Motors were actually able to come into the car market in Korea by buying themselves into it. So they stayed using the Daewoo name for a long time, but now they changed to General Motors, I think maybe 7-8 years ago. In the same way, once Samsung started making cars, they very quickly got into partnership with Renault. The cars that you see as a Samsung are actually a Renault in a different country. We're talking about major groups later on, but so Renault were able to come in. Also, since then, through free trade agreements, etc. Also through a cultural change. People now desire foreign goods a lot more in Korea, particularly sort of luxury goods. So you see an awful lot of BMWs and Mercedes around because people desire those. That also reflects in the change in the financial situation, that people are generally, I'd say, they must be more affluent to be able to afford these things, whereas years ago that wouldn't have happened so much. So in this way, the whole market has changed. And it's not because of anything that the existing competition did, it's really because of what happened in the environment around, which we'll get into a bit later. So things can be a lot more complex than what this model actually suggests. It also highlights the fact that you need to be aware that this is constantly changing. Because you don't have many problems with the competition at the moment, doesn't mean to say you will keep that in the future. Also about the entry barriers. Maybe they're difficult to enter a market now, but in the future, maybe it's not going to be difficult. Maybe something will change. So quite often in anything we do with strategy, we've got to be looking at the changes that are constantly happening to keep ahead of the game, to keep on top of what we're trying to do. Strategic groups, I briefly mentioned this. I'm going to put this down here. If we still talk about the car market, I mentioned before about BMWs and Mercedes. Well, there's two companies that are in the same strategic group. Quite often, if you're looking at one of them, you're going to consider the other one as well as a comparison. There are some other manufacturers that you might compare as well, but those two in particular are very, very close together. They may be branded differently, and people argue technically maybe they're different, but they're pretty much competing for the same people. Now, it's difficult for other manufacturers to move into that group. Hyundai have tried to do that with the Genesis. I'm not sure how successful that is in other countries. I'm not really sure how successful it is here. But to do that, they've had to kind of rebrand. They haven't used the Hyundai name because of the brand image. So they've tried to create this new brand to get over the image part of it. So here, one of the mobility barriers, one of the things that stops people getting into that is just the imagery, the brand image. BMW, Mercedes have a fantastic image, so you have to have something that can equal that. So you can't go in with the name of another company. That's why for a while General Motors didn't use one of their other brand names. They kept the Daewoo name in Korea because at the time they recognized the cultural aspect of Korean people wanted to buy Korean goods. Later, when they saw this change, that they're more willing and interested in buying other foreign cars, then they changed. So mobility barriers aren't just the technical aspects. Yes, you could argue that a car manufacturer like Hyundai isn't technically up to the level of BMW or Mercedes to be able to offer the same kind of refined goods as BMW and Mercedes do. That's maybe arguable because what they can do is they can buy in that expertise. They could recruit people from BMW or Mercedes or a similar company. So it's possible to build up that expertise. But again, the brand image is the thing that controls things there. So mobility barriers are an important aspect to consider. In the same way, I'll mention this again later, BMW have gone into a different area and they've bought out the Mini as you see it. I know it's made in the UK, but it's actually owned by BMW. BMW bought that part of the company that makes that, and they've done that so they can then go into a different part of the car market. Again, for them to move down into like a cheaper entered the market would maybe affect their BMW brand. So they want to retain that brand image as well as going into a different part of the market. So it works both ways as well. It's not just about going upwards, it's about different parts of the market. Okay, industry life cycle. Here is a fantastic chart that highlights the industry life cycle. Now let me just talk about this for a minute. This is an audio cassette. When I was your age, this is what you bought for music in your car. It was lower quality than the old record LPs, but obviously you couldn't play an LP in your car, if you know what an LP is. You can't buy these now, I'm pretty sure. I've got a few around, and they tend to, the product doesn't last very long either. They're almost unplayable now, if you've got something to play it on. Then along came the CD. I still have one of these in my car. I don't have, my car's old, so I don't have any way of playing an MP3 player or playing something on my phone, so I use CDs. If we look at the life cycle of these products, now this is product life cycle, which I'll explain the difference with in a minute. CDs came out in, I think, 1980s, and at the beginning, they were kind of a novelty. Very, very few people had them. The CDs were quite expensive compared to LPs. But the equipment was phenomenally expensive to buy. To buy a CD player was very, very expensive. So few people had them. So the demand was very low because of the expense. And this goes on for a while. As they're becoming more well known and people are talking about them more, and as they're looking at the products, they're finding cheaper ways to make them, the demand starts going up. And as demand goes up, they can produce more, so they can actually cut the cost, because producing in quantity reduces cost. So demand rises, costs go down, so demand keeps rising. So over time, we go from the embryonic stage, which is about here, and then my marker's packed up. She's back on. So we've gone from the embryonic stage into the growth stage. So this is where it starts growing. Actually, maybe a bit more up here. Then we get into a stage where most of the market is getting the product and they're maybe replacing product. Now, obviously, CDs, the CD itself, people are always buying new ones because of new music. But if we think about the CD players, it gets to a point where we've got a CD player and maybe we just want to replace it, maybe it's got something wrong with it, or they want a newer model. So everybody's got one. Getting into the maturity stage, it's really like they're not selling any more new products and people just replacing things. But then it starts going into decline, because at this point, we've got other things coming through. MP3s are coming through. And people are starting to switch over. So the MP3s are in there. If we look at the life cycle of them, it's down here. So it's starting to go up, and then this is starting to go down. Now here we can see that going into the decline stage, CD players have really dropped down. It's gone down here because people don't need to buy them anymore. There's a new kid on the block, and this is taken over completely. You might get a few odd sales, but it's negligible, it's nothing. in the same way with the cassette. These went down when CDs were going up. So here we've got different ways of different product. But be careful, industry it might include all of these products. It's the music industry. However, MP3s now are kind of gone because we've got everything on our phones. So here it's amalgamated into something else. So the music industry will probably keep going in different formats and different products, but the music industry will keep going. But the actual products will fall off and die. So there's a bit of a difference between industries and products. The book talks about the car industry and says, well, that's in the maturity stage, it's not going to get any bigger, which I would agree with. There will always be new customers because new people are passing their tests, but there's probably about the same level of number of customers. It could decline if people stop using cars so much. If people didn't need transportation so much. So, for example, if people started working from home more, like we are now, you might need less cars. If people use more public transport, you might need less cars. People using ride sharing like Uber, etc., or taxis, if they use that kind of transport more, then they need less cars. I don't think it's going to decline that much. I think there will always be a need for some kind of personal transport. Whether that's the car as we see it, or it would certainly go into different forms of cars like electric cars. You will see the petrol engine, the diesel cars die out probably reasonably quickly. But I think that's a case where when cars started, I'm going to draw all over this graph here. When cars started, they started like this. They've come up here, but it will just continue along. Okay. So not everything dies out in the life cycle. But again, it is in the stage of the life cycle in that mature stage when there isn't much more growth. And if there isn't more growth, it means that the demand might go down a little bit, but you've still got the existing competition. Now the problem here is if we look at exit barriers, how easy it is to get out of a market. For car manufacturers, it's probably very difficult to get out. If you think about what it takes to make a car, you've got a massive factory, a massive plant with all this specialized automated equipment for building these one-off products. So to get out of that, you pretty much have to throw that away. And then what do? You're probably not going to use that factory for anything, so you've pretty much just got to throw everything away. Nobody's going to buy it. So there is a loss in what you've got there. It's very hard to sell the land. It's kind of redundant land. It was a specialized factory. So it's a bit of a loss in investment. So what happens in these situations is you see some very fierce competition arise in the industry as they're really fighting to see who can survive. So in this case, you might see car manufacturers fighting to see who can survive in the market, because if they can survive a few more years, or maybe quite a bit longer, or maybe they can try and push other people out. So it's a difficult situation. So some companies will try and slowly get into other new markets as well to try and sort of balance this out, or make a gradual decline in one market and a gradual increase in another market. The macro environment, if we go back to, just briefly mention the 5 forces again. If we go back to this, if you look at the diagram in the book, the macro environment is really what surrounds all this. And it's what changes in the world It might be in your national environment or the global environment, more likely now, that influences these things. So for example, going back to the Korean car industry, I said that back in about 20 odd years ago, in Korea, politically, it was fairly well protected because it was difficult for companies outside of Korea to get into that market because of trade barriers. However, politically that changed and they reduced those trade barriers, which allowed more competition to come in. So we can see how watching what goes on in the outside environment will affect what happens in the marketplace here. In the same way, if we look at the way globalization has moved on, we can see now that other car manufacturers are manufacturing globally. You get a lot of Mercedes built in China now, which is more local, and they're building products specifically for the Asian market. And it might be changed, designed slightly for the Asian market. People are buying more from other countries. The global trade has opened up, so it's much, much easier. We talk about free trade agreements. It's so much easier to move stuff around the world and buy stuff around the world. We're not fixed in one market now. Again, globalization, people are traveling more. People want to experience more foreign experience, more foreign travel, more foreign goods. So this is affecting all the markets again. But it's also offering up opportunities. It allows the Korean companies to do more work overseas, much easier as well. Maybe set up manufacturing overseas, which helps them. If we look at technology changes, go back to CDs and cassettes. Technology has affected this. So keeping an eye on what happens with technology will make us aware about how it's going to affect our market. If we look at the music industry now, there's obviously a situation there where you used to pay, I don't know, maybe $15 at one point for one of these. Now people download onto a computer, onto their phone, etc., the music at a much, much cheaper price. And it's probably quite easy to download stuff for free as well. So how that changes the industry as well. There aren't these mega prices, there's not so much control over your product that you're selling. If you talk about the product being the music itself, so it's much, much harder to control. That's a very different environment. So the important thing about the macro environment is just really looking at those different aspects it talks about in terms of the political, the legal side of things, the technical side of things, about people themselves, the demographics, etc., how that's changing, and think about how that's going to affect your environment. Because every change there is, it will have a change. Or if you're looking at going into a new market, again, look at the environment in that market. If you're looking at going into a market, let's say in a different country, well, look at the social side of things. How do they do things differently? How do you need to change your product to get into that market? For example, I'm not sure now, 20 years ago, when I came to Korea, if you bought a car in Korea, every car had electric windows and air conditioning. Same car in the UK, made in Korea, sold in the UK, didn't. Had little winder windows and no air conditioning, because there wasn't really a demand for it. So they could make it cheaper, basically, for selling to the UK, but they actually charge more money for it. So it's important to look at the market and see, it might offer you opportunities to make things cheaper or to do things in different ways. Okay, that's it. that's it for this week. We're going to continue doing things online for the present. There is a piece of work I want you to do on there. I think I've called it an assignment or something. I want you to look at a particular company and try and evaluate sort of, you know, the competition, look at it in the 5 forces. If you don't know some of the answers, that's okay. You can leave those parts blank, but try and answer the questions that as much as possible. It will help you think about this and help you understand how this works. Okay. If you've got any questions, use the discussion part. You can ask open questions on there. The more open your questions are, other people are thinking the same thing. I can answer it to everybody. Okay, so it'll help other people as well. Okay, that's it. I will see you next time.